Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you about what we've done in Work Package 2 on developing the SEGRID Risk Management Methodology. It's an ISO IEC 27005 based methodology, and the aim is to provide smart grid stakeholders and DSOs with the tools to be able to analyze the risks and link these to the stakeholder business operations. And the methodology is a structured and in-depth methodology designed for smart grid risk management so that the stakeholders can better understand potential threats and vulnerabilities, manage risks, and take measures to contain and mitigate the risks. So in SEGRID, we've enhanced existing risk assessment methodologies in 3 ways. Using the HMG Information Assurance Standard number 1 as a foundation extended with the multi-stakeholder view, SEGRID extends with network risk management method, which it provides us with the tools to be able to gain insight on the interdependencies between the stakeholders, responsibilities to each other, and how the risks propagate in the value chains. And SEGRID extends the impact assessment step to include a practical approach to assessing societal impact in the case of a power outage caused by a cyber attack. And SEGRID also implies an enhancement to the ETSI standard for threat, vulnerability, and risk assessment to include the assessment of the attacker's capability and motivation in the risk assessment step. And this is because we expect that attackers attacking smart grids will be more motivated and more capable than the average attacker. So on the next slides, is everything okay? Just go on? Okay, sorry. So on the next slides, I will explain these enhancements in the context of the Ukrainian distribution grid, which provides us with a real example of a power outage caused by a cyber attack enacted deliberately by a highly capable and motivated threat source. So step 1 is the context and scoping step of the risk assessment. And applied to the Ukrainian case, here I will demonstrate how this step is enhanced using the NRM's notion of scopes to model the use case. And a scope in the NRM has obligations and expectations of other scopes, and each scope has one owner who is responsible for ensuring that the obligations of a scope are satisfied and remain fulfilled. And in SEGRID, an NRM scope is typically the scope of one stakeholder. So in this simplified view of the Ukrainian distribution grid, there are 4 stakeholders: the DSO, the customer, society, and the energy supplier. And the DSO has obligations and expectations as owner of this, the distribution grid. And the customer and society have expectations to the DSO. He expects that the DSO provides an unlimited energy supply, and the energy supplier has expectations on the DSO to meet its obligation of providing a steady distributed energy for a stable medium voltage grid. And as you can see, the DSO also has internal expectations on the SCADA system in order to be able to control the grid and deliver the energy, and which in turn has internal expectations on the primary and secondary substations and the corporate IT network. In the next step is the impact assessment step. And here we assess the obligation impact, which is an assessment of the maximum impact, the worst case, if the obligation is not fulfilled. We also enhance this step with the societal impact, which is the assessment of the maximum impact, that is the worst case, if an attack causes a power outage. And for this, SEGRID has adopted the approach from the FP7 Project Viking to plot the power outages on a social impact magnitude scale, and then map these to impact scales. So if we look at the example from the Ukrainian power grid, which was attacked in December 2015, 225,000 customers lost power for between 1 and 6 hours. And so calculating this, the impact level, which depends on the duration of the outage and the number of people affected, maps to just above impact magnitude 6 there. And then it is mapped to a societal impact level of high. The next step, actually I will summarize. The outage's impact can be related to 3 obligations. It's related to the DSO's obligation to the customer. So this is a brief outage for the customer, which would give an obligation impact rating between low and medium. And the DSO's obligation to society, there's a high societal impact due to fines and additional regulations on the DSO. So the estimation of the impact, if this obligation is not fulfilled, would be related to high. And then the DSO's obligation to the energy supplier, the third stakeholder. The energy supplier can't supply energy to its customers and loses income. So the obligation impact related here would be rated to between medium and high. And the output from this step is an identification of the DSO's critical assets, which form the focus of interest for the threat assessment step. So the next step is to do the threat and vulnerability assessment. And in this step, what we do is we model the attack trees, the different attack paths. In the example shown, only the attack path for the Ukrainian attack is shown. However, other attack paths are possible. And then this results in a detailed description of the threat scenario. And the analysis includes the identification of the threat sources and threat actors and any exploitable vulnerabilities. The next step is so now that we have a good understanding of the threat scenarios, we need to estimate the risks. And what I will do is I will talk about the ETSI standard as it was, and then I will explain the enhancement that was done in SEGRID. So since we are based on the IS-1 standard, we consider the threat to be a combination of the attacker's motivation, opportunity, and capability to carry out the attack. But what ETSI does is for the likelihood assessment, with the TV array, we estimate the likelihood that an attack on the asset will be successful. So it's a combination of 5 factors: time, expertise, knowledge, equipment, and opportunity, resulting in a weighted sum of how difficult it is to attack the asset. So it combines the opportunity and capability required to attack the asset. And if it's very difficult to attack it, then the vulnerability rating is high, and the likelihood is highly unlikely. Okay, for the impact assessment, it's a combination of the impact from step 2 along with the intensity of the attack. And in the case of the Ukrainian attack, 3 DSOs were impacted, and so it has a rating of high intensity. And then for the risk, of course, it's a combination of the likelihood and impact to get the risk. Okay, so ETSI takes care of the opportunity and capability required to carry out the attack, but what about the motivation of the attacker or the capability the attacker has to do? Does an attacker actually exist? What is the likelihood of that? So what we see is that likelihood also depends on the level of motivation and the capability of the attacker. And we have real examples today, both with Stuxnet and the Ukrainian power outage, that these are real examples that demonstrate that the threat actor capability and motivation influence the likelihood of an attack being carried out and being successful. So on the next slide, I will explain how we went from the TV array to the enhancement. So we start at the starting point, which is how likelihood is estimated with the TV array. It's based on the common criteria evaluation methodology, where you rate the attack scenario required to, worst case, to attack the asset. And it results in a weighted sum of the 5 factors. And that weighted sum is then mapped to a vulnerability rating, and which is then mapped to the likelihood. However, it doesn't take into account the level of motivation and capability of the attacker, which also influence whether the attack will actually take place and be successful. So then what we did was as we are also based on IS-1, we took the assessment of the threat actor and the threat source related to their capability and motivation to establish the threat level. So a highly capable and motivated attacker means that the threat level is severe. And then we take the threat level and we combine it with the vulnerability rating to obtain the likelihood of the attack. So as you can see with the table, even if it's very difficult to attack the system, if there is a highly motivated and capable threat actor, then the likelihood jumps to possible. Okay. So, to summarize, the enhancement that SEGRID has done is in the likelihood estimation, we take the vulnerability rating, which is an assessment of the opportunity and required capability, which is combined with the threat level, which is the motivation and capability of the threat actor. And this is how the likelihood is estimated. And we didn't do anything with the impact estimation, which combines the obligation impact with the attack intensity to obtain the impact, and then the impact is combined with likelihood to obtain the risk. Okay. So, to summarize, basically, with this methodology, we aim to provide with the tools, stakeholders and DSOs with the tools to analyze risks and link them to stakeholders' business operations, so that the stakeholders can relate the technical risks to the obligations in order to explain the risks in business terms. So in closing, I'd like to summarize the SEGRID Risk Management Methodology, each of the steps. So during the context establishment and scoping step, we defined NRM obligations, expectations, and verify if they match between the scopes. And during the impact assessment step, we assess the impact on obligations in each scope. And we identify the focus of interest to narrow down the threat assessment step to the critical assets with respect to these scopes. And then during the threat and vulnerability assessment step, we model the threats and vulnerabilities. We use attack trees, or we can use other types of tools like SysML to do a detailed vulnerability analysis. And in the step 4, risk estimation and prioritization, we apply the enhancements of the ETSI TVRA to identify risks, and then we relate these to the obligations for prioritization. So that in step 5, we are able to identify the mitigations required, and then we make the risk treatment report structured along the obligations and expectations. And finally, the risk acceptance decision is made using the ownership of the NRM scope. So just some concluding remarks. So the SEGRID Risk Management Methodology builds on state-of-the-art risk assessment methodologies while providing guidance and enhancements for use in smart grids. And the SEGRID, in our project, we've enhanced risk assessment in 3 ways. We've enhanced it by including the assessment of the societal impact, and also with including the concepts from the network risk management methodology to improve insight independencies between the stakeholders. And we also include the threat actor motivation and capability in the estimation of the likelihood for the risk estimation step. And actually, our enhancement to the TVRA has been accepted by ETSI in the next version of the standard. So this ensures that our work on threat vulnerability and risk assessment will be used. And I only had 15 minutes to just give you a brief introduction to this today. But if you would like to read more about this in the next issue of IEEE Computer in April, there will be an article describing the the enhancements that have been done in SEGRID with the SEGRID Risk Management Methodology. Okay, thank you.